Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Living Experiment Podcast Live Edition. I stopped calling it COVID Edition because that just is getting old, much like COVID. But I'm really glad to be back in my own little studio today with a very special guest who I'll introduce in just a moment. I want to begin by saying thank you to those of you who are joining or will join us live. As you know, the Living Experiment normally is recorded in studio. Dallas and I have typically gone to great lengths to be together in studio to record all of our episodes live. But during the past year and a half or so, with books and COVID, we haven't been able to do that. So I've done a series of guest interviews here live on the internet, broadcasting to our Facebook page and some other locations. And I've mostly had the luck of getting good friends and brilliant thinkers to join me for conversations that are much like the conversations I have with Dallas, but on topics that are far ranging. And today is no exception. Today, I'm really excited to be welcoming a guest who is both a dear friend and an incredible mentor of mine, Dorothy Kalins. And before I have her into the studio, I just want to shamelessly plug her new book, which we'll continue to shamelessly plug for the rest of the hour, called The Kitchen Whisperers: Cooking with the Wisdom of Our Friends. And there are a lot of reasons I'm really excited about this book, not the least of which is that it made me laugh and cry and think and want to eat and live better. But also because it's Dorothy's book and I've been waiting for it for so long. Dorothy, I'm really glad to have you joining us here. Thank you for being a guest on the Living Experiment podcast.
Oh, it's great. So much fun to be here.
Congratulations on your book. I know this is in a long line of brilliant books that you have written and or worked on, but this is a really special book, and I know you've been working on it for a long time. Like, when did you start working on this?
I guess I started when I started living my life, but it came together it was very much a pandemic book written in my office, which I was grateful to have. All this last year. And so over the last 2 years, I got to dive deep into things stories that I thought were worth telling. And the idea of the book really came because as I cook in the kitchen, I realized that there are people in my head. Now, the publisher didn't want me to use voices in my head because they thought that sounded like I was a crazy person. But really, things that I do, and when you're alone in the kitchen, you talk to yourself, you realize that you learn things and retain things that are odd and very personal, but that really do shape the way you live and cook and be.
Yeah. Yep. Well, everyone, I think, can relate to that idea that the voices, the wisdom of the people that either, you learned at their elbow to cook, or you learned things about their ideas of food from them, just their predilections and preferences and prejudices. But your particular set of voices is extraordinary given your background professionally, as well as your background as a person. But, professionally, so you're the founding editor of Forager magazine, which is still so beloved by so many, as well as founding editor of Metropolitan Home, garden design. You're the executive editor at Newsweek when I met you through the publishing course at Stanford, then at Yale. And the entire time I've known you, you've been a walking legend for people in the food world. Everybody knows your name. You can be, modest about that. But everyone that I know, when I just mention who you are, they're like, oh my gosh, you know her? And I feel really privileged. I was so clueless when I first met you. I just thought you were a magazine editor of incredible import. Now I know more about your relationship and history with food and food journalism and food personalities. And I realize what you've encapsulated in this book is like the who's who of you are literally in the who's who of the food world, but everyone in this book is someone who either is dear and near to you personally and or super accomplished change maker legend in their own right in the food world. I wonder, did you decide to include this particular range of voices from relatives all the way to the superheroes of the food world. Did you have to extract them on some basis, or were these just literally the voices that you hear when you're cooking?
I've been very lucky in my life because I've only worked on passion projects. All my magazines have been things that I believed in and have been lucky enough to do that, always with the idea of communicating to a reader. I mean, that was the conversation was me and a reader. It was not me and fancy people or me and fancy restaurants. It was me and the reader, and trying to boil down and distill the most important things. So when I had this idea, and the idea came to me, Pilar, when I was washing lettuces I'd gone to the farmer's market, came home, and there were, the muddy root ends of vegetables that you inevitably get when you come back from the farmer's market. And I literally heard a French grandmother who I met, who's my stepdaughter's grandmother, but we all have lives like that. And she said to me, "Il faut laver la salade 3 fois." You have to wash your lettuce 3 times to get all the dirt off of it. And this particular woman lived in a little house with a garden out in front, and you had to go through the garden to get to her front door. And I thought, there's nothing more authentic than that. But it was her voice. And I thought, a lot of people, I mean, I produced a food magazine and cookbooks and wonderful things, but what really sticks with you? What do you carry with you? And as I began to define the whisperers in my own life, I thought, other people have them too. And maybe this book will cause them to think about their own lives and the people whose voices they hear and whose wisdom they carry in their bones. And it was never to be a memoir. This is not a memoir. I mean, it's a personal book, but it's not a memoir. It's a book about connecting.
Yeah. Yep. Well, it's telling to me that you begin and end the book with chapters on mothers and daughters.
Yeah.
In fact, it's the exact same title, which I thought was brilliant. And that full circle of what you learned from your mother, as well as what you imparted to your daughter, or didn't. And those were the chapters, I think that for me resonated personally at the level of, wow, I like your relationship with your mom, my relationship with my mom. And I think many people in my generation who were among the last generation to have mothers who cooked at home on a regular basis. I mean, there's like a whole set of generations to follow for whom cooking is either something very special that you have to learn as a skill on the Food Network, or it's something that you get other people to do.
Yeah.
But that experience of cooking at home and beginning to understand the personalities of the people, whether they, in my case, Greek grandmothers and aunts, who made spanakopita from hand and had their very, very specific opinions. Yeah, things like, wow. And I hadn't really thought about that. Or the description, of that you describe is maybe not even a false memory of your mother guiding the wooden spoon around a bowl in the cookie dough. It was so... I could feel my mother's hands on my pudgy little arms and that wooden spoon, that old wooden spoon and that cracked bowl. And I was like, these are memories that I haven't unearthed in decades, but they're there, and they are body memory in many cases of how you do or don't do certain things.
That's right.
It's interesting to me in reading this. I know you say it's not a memoir, and I guess technically it's not, but there are so many personal memories in it. I'm curious if in starting with your memories of your mother, who, while she cooked regularly, as you noted, this was just a nightly thing you did. It wasn't,
who she was. Yeah.
Who you were. Yeah. Whether it was striking to you at all, how a passion that is so deeply rooted within you was clearly not born at your mother's elbow. Right. I mean, where did yours?
I also make the point that I was not blessed with a lot of grandmothers who cooked. I didn't even have... My father's mother died when my dad was very young, and my mother's mother decamped for Israel somewhere in my young life, high school life perhaps, and I never saw her again. So I have no family memories like that, but they're very compelling nonetheless. Every memoir you read, and when we started Sever, we were in love with grandmothers.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like the arc from where you began the book, what you took away from your mother and her relationship with food, from the anxiety of putting on a dinner, really, it felt like that
Right,
performance,
right,
all the way to the end, where your own daughter, acknowledges, so she hasn't fully embraced the same passion that you do. She's more tempted to order
right,
in. She's got a busy
right,
life, and
right.
in between there, are the stories of your relationships with, some of the world's great chefs and food writers. And is there a high point for you in all of that feels like, wow, I knew I had made it when, as a food intelligent person whose passion for food kind of wasn't attached on either end really to your relationship with your family so much, although I know that both Roger and Lincoln play a role in the book. But it feels like this is a journey you went on kind of on your own, like it was almost self-propelled in some way. What
Well,
what started that for you?
well, interestingly, when we did, I've always been the kind of editor who likes to surround herself with the smartest people. I mean, I've never been a prima donna editor. I've always been an us, and it's always been get the smart people in the room and let's figure it out. And even when I was at Met Home, I was surrounded by wonderfully smart people, and as it turned out, we were able to chronicle the birth of a real new American cuisine, what I called the new American cuisine, and what we actually wrote a cookbook at Met Home called the New American Cuisine, because our generation were the people, the chefs who were not trying to be like some three-star French restaurateur. They were not trying to replicate things from uh, formal kitchens. They were really trying to say, okay, we're American. What do we have here in this country that we can celebrate? Because we should be celebrating it. And I'm talking about people like Alice Waters and Jonathan Waxman and Larry Forgione and Wolfgang Puck. I mean, all the people who really shaped that generation. And we did stories because Coleman Andrews, who was then the restaurant critic of the LA Times, but he also was a wonderful writer and started writing for us early on. And that's what he was interested in, and that's what I became interested in. And so we published some of the earliest and most important stories about these Americans who were finding their way and defining. I mean, when you think about it, there really weren't the farmers markets that we have now everywhere. Everywhere you walk in, you drive into any small town in America, and there's a farmers market on Saturday, or there's a table set out in front of the town hall. It's become, and of course that's what happened. That's what it was like for the early settlers, not the earliest settlers, but for when American culture began around small towns. That's what it was like, and I think we've reclaimed those roots.
Yeah. It's such an interesting point that in some ways the work that you were doing at the first part of your food writing, food editing, food thinking career kind of bridged this gap between the lost food arts of the tradition, when we actually all had gardens and found food that was growing around our house basically to eat. And then this kind of hysteria, the frenzy, it feels like, of the present day obsession with TV Food Network and YouTube videos that are really more about, again, kind of that performance of cooking, or making specific recipes, or, following a kind of formula to get something that looks a certain way. And that you kind of glorify that, but we forget that art of cooking food that people really want to eat. And a point made by Danny Meyer in his foreword to your book, which I loved, by the way, that it's not all of the fanciest and most impressive stuff, and it's not the most convenient stuff. It's the stuff that is real and
Well,
looks.
he makes the point about going out and coming home, and that's, you know, that's kind of where I am. Coming home is really important, and even when I've done cookbooks with very famous chefs, it's always been about bringing it home.
Yeah,
The Gramercy Tavern cookbook, for example, was never about trying to replicate what this stratospheric talent in the kitchen could produce. It was really about, well, how can you saute a fish fillet at home in a little frying pan with a knob of butter and a sprig of rosemary and a little piece of garlic, and how can you make that work?
yeah,
And that translation was always what I was most interested in. And I believe that people buy those books not because they want to try to replicate what they can find on a Saturday night on 20th Street. They want to be able to come to approach the ingredients and the combinations of things that speak to them.
yeah,
So it's not about cooking mania at all. It's about, I think it starts with a respect for the ingredients.
yeah. Well, and there's a confidence that comes from having a relationship with that range of ingredients. When you start to know a fish from another fish, but what the fish have in common, or
Mhm.
greens from another green, but what those greens have in common. A really one example of that struck me that I've learned from living with Alan, my
Yes.
partner, who's the Forager Chef, is a point that you made in the book that, and I don't remember which food personality it was now. It was no, it wasn't Marcella because she cooked those stems of the chard into smithereens, but thinking of the stem and the leaves of the chard as separate vegetables, or that they need different cooking times and techniques, it really hadn't occurred to me until I really, I saw what Alan was doing. I was like, well, what's that about? Or what am I eating here?
That's right. And
And it's
yeah,
a breakthrough.
you see them differently. You see ingredients very differently. I tell the story about when we were doing a California issue for Saveur, and Coleman and Christopher, my two co-founders, are both native Californians, and then there was me. And so the three of us we started way in the north, right over the border, and our first night, we rented a little house on the coast of Northern California, and they were known for smoking salmon, and they had huge, vast smokehouses, and it was all over, the politically correct wood, and it was beautiful. And so we decided to cook a dinner for the issue. What would the food in the issue be? Well, the food in the issue would be the food of California. So Coleman made a pasta with beautiful smoked salmon, and Christopher made a pie from the blueberries that came from the roadside. And I saw these great armloads of Swiss chard in a farm stand. I said, oh, we have to do that. And I got home, or back to the house where we'd rented, and I thought, I don't know what to do with these Swiss chards. I don't know they're so huge that I didn't even know what to do with it. And it wasn't until years later, when I was lucky enough to go with Christopher to do a story for Saveur on David Tanis, who also has a chapter in this book, and he at that time was the chef at Chez Panisse, and he would work 6 months a year. He had a wonderful life, 6 months a year at Chez Panisse in Berkeley, and 6 months a year he would cook and live in Paris. So we took him to his local market, which you will remember since you have a very fond memory of France, and it was in the Fifth. And we said to David, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to pick out the ingredients, and you're going to cook them no matter what. So we saw, for example, I never could quite get my mind around foie gras. I mean, how do you treat this swollen liver? And so we went to a poultry stand and bought a big lobe of foie gras. And we said, okay, you're going to show us how to make a terrine out of this. And he said, I am. And we said, you are. And and of course, he said, these foods are, they're so now they're so, high end, but really there's just peasant food. It's cooking the liver of something. And
organ meats, right? We
so
turn our nose up at them mostly.
so I saw a huge stand full of these wonderful Swiss chard plants. So we bought an armload of that. I said, David, you're going to show me how to really do this. And so for him, it was so simple. He said, first of all, chard is two vegetables. It's the stems and it's the leaves, and you treat them differently. So the first thing that he did was cut the leaves away from the stems, chop the stems up into little batons, and blanch them quickly in hot water, and then put them aside. And then he rolled the leaves all together up like a cigar and cut them, sliced them. So all of a sudden, it was just a pile of greens, a pile of very manageable greens. And he made a gratin. He made a bechamel sauce with the batons, the little roots, the celery roots, and then the celery stems, and then the Swiss chard leaves, and then of course then it gets demystified, and then you understand it.
Yeah.
And then you love it.
And then you love it. And then you
love it. And then you realize, hey, there are a lot of other leaves that grow exactly like that.
Right. Right. And the point that you make too, that like, okay, you were talking about like flavors that go well with these greens, nutmeg, check. Like pretty soon you start building a mental checklist of what you can do that works. And as Alan says, flavors that like other flavors, or ingredients that like other flavors. So this is sort of at that intersection of, kind of what we think is like haute cuisine, the fanciest chefs with the fanciest ingredients in Paris. But it really comes down to fundamentally, how do you work with really basic ingredients to make them taste good in ways that you can have work at any dinner, quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that makes me think I wanted to have you share a little piece of your book that has to do with meatloaf and trying to recapture the flavors of your youth. And I so relate to this, that some of the things that we think of, as comfort foods, they may not even be the most fantastic foods. They're these foods that we relate to a particular time or phase or relationship. And you went casting back, trying to find your mother's meatloaf in a really interesting and funny story. Would you mind reading a little section of that? I think it's on page 36 in my copy.
Thank you. I think all the copies are the same.
Are they the same? Okay, good. Well, I never know with those advanced proofs if they're going to mess with you, but I have the hard copy here. So I think that's the real deal, which is lovely. Okay.
Only a very bad child would not remember her mother's meatloaf. My mother's was yummy, loose and juicy and tomatoey. It was soft, unlike those thick school cafeteria slabs made dense with too many breadcrumbs and too little finesse. It certainly did not contain, as Roger remembers his mom's version did, an entire package of Lipton's onion soup mix. But which meatloaf recipe is it? I flipped through her recipe box to the section marked meats, and now I'm stuck. Did she make a New York Times recipe pasted on its own card called meatloaf with peppers and mushrooms? Or meatloaf with tofu? Ew! Did she make Craig Claiborne's Italian meatloaf from a yellowed page torn from a New York Times Sunday magazine piece entitled Hamburger Above and Beyond? Did she agree with what Craig told his readers? Filet mignon may be fancier and Chateaubriand more chic, but nothing appeals to the American appetite like ground beef. His recipe does not seem familiar, even as it calls for a few spoonfuls of grated Parmesan cheese, and I can see the umami advantage. It doesn't play right in my taste memory. What did my mother do? I'm guessing that, unlike me, she didn't overthink it and just made the damn meatloaf. 3 pounds of ground meat, seasoned with whatever dried herbs she had on hand, sauteed onions, canned stewed tomatoes. I picture her soaking a couple of handfuls of torn bread in milk first, But did she know she was making a panade, the suave French thickener? Was she aware of how key that addition of panade was to making her meatloaf lovely? I don't think so. Her graceful fingers would shape the meat into a loaf, plop it into a rectangular pan, and pour on canned tomato sauce. And on top of that, most certainly ketchup, Heinz, from a bottle. What I had to go on was a recollection of taste and texture, mind picture, recipe, forensics. I recall a trek to a meat processing warehouse in North Bergen, New Jersey, where I went hoping to tease out secrets from the famous meat impresario Pat LaFrida for Shake Shack, the cookbook I produced for that spirited enterprise. The Shack secret blend dies with me, Pat warns me. He does, however, share some advice. Always get the butcher to grind your meat, he declares, unsmiling. You never know how many days the pre-ground stuff has sat in the butcher case. And he continues, forget economy cuts. The flavors in the whole muscles. The legendary Shack burger, I might as well share with you, should be a twice ground mixture of either brisket and chuck for a light blend or short rib and chuck for a rich blend. I do recall the makeup of my mother's meatloaf, 1/3 beef, 1/3 pork, 1/3 veal, but my politically correct organic butcher does not even carry veal. In their charming book, A Meatloaf in Every Oven, the New York Times writers Frank Bruni and Jennifer Steinhauer laugh in the face of veal. Frank, quote, there's a place for veal in meatloaf, but is limited. There is altogether too much veal in meatloaf. Jen, let's get right there and say it. Veal is sort of the truffle oil of meats, which definitely convinces me not to use veal in my effort to recreate my mother's meatloaf, or as close to it as I can come. I go with a mix of 1.5 pounds chuck, the muscle meat, and 3/4 of a pound of pork, freshly ground together as my butcher suggests before my eyes. In a bowl, I tear up 4 slices of good bread, crust removed and later sauteed in olive oil for salad croutons, and soak the bread in a cup of milk until soft. I add 2 beaten eggs and a 1/2 cup of chopped parsley, mix it up, then stir that mixture into the ground meat that's waiting in a bigger bowl. I chop and lightly saute 2 medium onions in olive oil, then add them to the bowl. Then come salt, pepper, and a 1/2 teaspoon each of fennel seed, grated nutmeg, and pimenton, a spice my mother, of course, had never heard of, but necessary to me now. But no funny stuff. No olives or cheese or bacon or pancetta or beans or mushrooms or anchovies or hot sauce. I mix the meat well in with my hands, a childhood pleasure I do recall. Then pat it into a loose mound in a rectangular baking dish. A loaf pan is too confining and drying. I pour a cup of good tomato sauce over the top and slide the dish into a preheated 370-degree oven. About 20 minutes in, and in homage to my mom, and because it tastes like childhood, I squirt ketchup from a plastic squeeze bottle she never dreamed of over the top. Scattered dried oregano on top, and baste the meatloaf with its pan juices. At about 45 minutes total, I take the meatloaf's temp. It should be about 150 degrees, and that's it. It's a little bit country and a little bit rock and roll.
I just love that. It's such a perfect example of that melding. You know, what you legitimately learn from your mother, what you're having to fill in the blanks of with memory, the parts of you can't resist, you know, this spice or that upgrade. But like, you know, the nod to the ketchup on top, you have to have that. Like,
Yeah,
it's just, it wouldn't be the same.
That's the flavor memory. Yeah.
It's funny, not too long ago, I was talking to my mom, my sister Andrea and I, about the same time, talking about food forensics, had this sudden recollection of my mother making us clam spaghetti when we were younger. And I remembered that was my favorite, like for my birthday, when I was like, what do I want? Clam spaghetti. This is just like canned clams that you'd get from the A&P type store, you know?
Right.
I think olive oil, garlic, and it was served over spaghetti with a little lemon or something, salt and pepper. And that was it. And I mean, she's like, why do you want the recipe for that? I was like, I don't know. I think it was my favorite food. But the smell, and Andrea and I have now tried, each of us twice, to repeat.
To replicate that recipe? Uh-huh.
Can't quite get it. So we are forcing my mother, fortunately is still with us, to do it with us at our and show us. Now
Right.
my mother does a lot of things that are very impressive, from sourdough breads that she makes with grinding her own flour to, and she's a very simple home cook. This is not none of it's fancy, but a lot of it requires way more skill than this. But it's her touch and it's the specific methodology that we both have an appetite for. We're hungry for, not just for the flavor and the dish, but the whole aspect of our childhood and
Sure.
nostalgically remembering that experience and who we were to our
Mhm,
mother, I think even
mhm,
at that time.
mhm.
And that's all part of the experience of cooking and eating that I feel like you capture with such sensitivity in this book. And parts of it really did make me cry. I think sometimes you realize too late that you can't learn at someone's
Yeah,
elbow because they're
yeah,
no longer there.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The other piece that I really appreciated was the biscuits that, again, super simple, like 3 ingredients or 4 ingredients, but
Yes.
the rigor
It was
of
a
getting that.
world. Yes.
Yeah. Would you talk a little bit about that as sort of, you know, I want to give people a sense of the, I guess, not the extremes, but the different ends of the spectrum of the food that you are enchanted enough with to describe at great detail in this book. And I think what you just read, thank you, by the way, from the meatloaf section there, I think is a great example of like how these intersecting memories and bits of technology and all kind of come together in something that only now you own, really. Like you're the only person to have integrated all of your food experiences and memories and all of this technology. But on the one hand, there's meatloaf and biscuits. And at the other end, there's, hanging out with Marcella Hazan and David Tanis and, having these amazing dinners, your stomach club dinners and things. Where do you feel the most at home in those memories?
I think the memories themselves are what make you feel comforted and surrounded and in touch with history. And I don't ever think this is, I mean, if you watch, um, I've been lucky enough to work with two people who have won the James Beard Outstanding Chef of the Known World. One is Michael Anthony of Gramercy Tavern, and the other is Michael Solomonov of Zahav in Philadelphia. They're two very different approaches to food, but it's all the same. It really is all the same. They revere their ingredients. I mean, downstairs in Gramercy Tavern, when the shopper comes back from the Union Square Farmers Market where he's bought all the ingredients for the day, there's nothing more exciting than unpacking the fresh peas when they arrive, and then all of a sudden Michael will think about, all right, what does that become, and how do I prepare it so that I stay very close to what that flavor is.
Yeah.
And that's the American sensibility. It's not, how do I transform it into some angel's version of what a pea can be. It's simply, how do I unpod them and serve them so that they taste the way they look to me, the way they were at the market. And I think that really bridges the high-low gap. I don't find that, even though these chefs are very laden with awards and accolades, it's not for the fancy things they do, it's for the honest things they do. At least
Mhm.
those are the people to which I gravitate.
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly the kind of person that you are. I mean, in the work, and let's remember, you're no stranger to Beard Awards yourself, that it seems like what stands the test of time is something that delights in more than one way. It's the experience. And even in reading this, there's so much sensory pleasure. There's so much uh, human experience packed in to the presentation, the choosing of the ingredients, the preparation of the ingredients, the fun of preparing it, and the stress of having it potentially go wrong. It's really like a whole like hero's journey from the idea that we're going to make something to eat to the actual eating it, and all of the drama that can happen in between. The thing that's interesting to me is that right now in our food culture, I feel like so many people have become terrified of food and nutritionism, what we should or shouldn't eat, which ingredients are good or not good, clean or not clean, acceptable or not acceptable.
Yes.
That there's a kind of angst in even choosing to eat at all. And I
Yes.
think so many
That's right.
yeah. And I feel like this book is an antidote to that in some ways. Like it kind of settles you back into a fuller experience of being an eater and an appreciator of food that feels like it's it's a touch from the invisible world. It's sort of ensouling food again. And I've missed that. I think, like I said, I grew up in a generation of people that I was lucky. My mom cooked most of our meals at home, and I feel profoundly grateful that I had that experience. But I then moved into this world that, I live in now of health and fitness and well-being, supposedly.
And
But what I see
and foraging.
and now, yeah, and foraging. And, that is really kind of, for me too, a full return back to the way that we ate as a kid growing up on a farm. My mom foraged all the time. It was just what was available. The weeds in the garden were as good as the vegetables in the garden, so you might as well eat them all.
Absolutely.
But I spent a long time, like I think a lot of the folks, in this world, people who listen to this podcast, of kind of going out away into a world of reading packages for how many calories does it have, and like, getting worried about carbs.
Being afraid of food.
Very much so. And feeling incompetent to produce food that would be acceptable to my own health motivations. And that was a real mind mess, for a long time. Coming home to food in its fullness and the delights that you can experience, where the gratification of eating it is on so many different levels and so much more nutritious at a deep level, not just the chemistry of the food, but the essence of it. I feel like there's something happening now, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit from your perspective as a journalist and a food person, where maybe we're getting back to a merging of understanding that for food to be truly healthy, it needs to come from healthy soil and healthy systems and be cared for by healthy minded people.
Yeah.
And, I'm curious, in your experience, there's a lovely section on the cook in the garden, like that relationship of, it's a whole different set of food technologies and techniques. But in a world where people are still struggling, particularly right now during the pandemic, to get their hands on decent ingredients, and even mid-sized towns and things, do you see a return to people's interest in finding and producing their own food as a means of eating better?
Well, I think there's no question that that has been an outgrowth of the pandemic, is that people realize they have a backyard, and if they can improve the soil enough to grow something, and what an extraordinary experience that is. I think the tyranny of agribusiness and of processed food manufacturing is maybe on the wane in this country. And I think that what you're talking about, that the death sentence of reading an ingredients list. Well, you know what? I buy so little from a supermarket anymore. I just don't. I want what I can buy, and thank you, Lord, for having the season right now that we're still in, and when we can live on tomatoes and corn and greens and whatever we find in the market, that's what we do. And the idea of opening a package of anything. Now, I do talk about there's certain enhancers that are purely made and that are beautiful and that make a big difference. I mean, I talk about how Mike Solomonoff and Stephen Cook from Zahav in the book that we did, Israeli Soul, kind of introduced me to uh, pepper blends like harissa that come in a jar and that are they're wonderful, just on scrambled eggs, simple like that. And those are pure ingredients. They don't have a lot of thises and that's in the jar. You look in the jar and it's peppers and olive oil and a little bit of spices, and that's it. And I think that those flavor enhancers are very necessary to varying the fresh produce that we buy in the market. But that's the way I cook now. And I think that the reliance of our reliance growing up on prepared foods is gone. I mean, for a lot of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a really great point that, figuring out how to eat in a way that is sustainable for your schedule, for your health, for your budget, like that is an art. And I think increasingly, like you said, it's like we're choosing to reclaim it by necessity
Right.
because what we've been doing hasn't been working. But then there's like, you have to fight your way back through the clutter of all the fussiness, of like the 15 million cookbooks, and bazillions of recipes and food that has to be delivered in kits to your door in a box, as opposed to learning how to fluently work with mostly whole food ingredients most of the time,
Right.
and create a range of different things based on, what you have on hand and what you're in the mood for. And that to me is really, that's the wisdom that's at the essence of your book, and the whisperers, the beauty of having the lived experience of dozens of other people in our lives who have also not had to learn it from scratch because they learned it from their whisperers.
Right.
That you get this passed on, sort of an oral and elbow level tradition.
Well, that's the hope, that people will recognize that there is a thread through all of this, and that we all learn from the people around us, and then we keep the parts of it that speak to us.
Yeah, yeah. Do you feel like, I know that the book has just come out. Is it today or yesterday? When is this book?
Yesterday was Pub Day. Yep.
Congratulations. I know that it's early, but like, who do you hope will read this book and get something out of it beyond the obvious? I know the people I suspect in the inner sanctum of the foodie world are going to go crazy because it's just like there's so many names and dishes and amazing things.
I don't know what the foodie world is anymore, and I don't know what I that kind of hip, kind of high, hot, not me, not that, that world has never interested me. What's in and what's out. I mean, I try to say there's a chapter in the book called The Immigrants' Pantry, which kind of gets back to the idea of enhancing natural food with more natural food, like, for example, sesame seeds. Well, when I started working with Mike Solomonov in Philadelphia on Zahav, I didn't know what tahini. I mean, I sort of knew tahini, but I did, I knew it like that little can that you have in the back of your refrigerator, and it's kind of oily and it's disgusting and whatever. Yeah. And then I realized that, like all farmed things, when sesame seeds are properly grown and properly handled and properly processed, they make the purest food. I mean, this is biblical food. This goes back to the very first people who ever grew and ate anything, and how tahina, and there's a wonderful company called Zoom Tahina, which is based in Philadelphia, and three sisters started this company, and they process they get the sesame seeds that are grown perfectly and beautifully in Ethiopia. They ship them to Israel. They process the jars of Zoom tahini, and they send it to America. And it's one that Mike uses in all his restaurants. And it's what I buy it online now, and they do sell it. But using that pure substance, it's old, new, it's ancient, and it's trendy. We have in the Israeli Soul Cookbook 5-minute hummus, where you take 2 cans of chickpeas and process it with that beautiful zoom tahini and some and lemon and it can go on anything, on any vegetable. So it's pure with pure, but it's flavor enhancing. And I think
Yeah.
that those are the kinds of things that we're learning. We're learning pepper sauces the same way. I mean, I'm learning, and there are people and cultures that have known those for years, and notably every Latin American cook and every Spanish cook is, depended on peppers.
Yeah.
But I came late to peppers. And I talk about that in the book, and how they're flavor enhancers. So it's not just taking the Swiss chard from the market and boiling it up. It's somehow these flavor enhancers, preserving our own lemons so we get another hit of flavor. I mean, you happen to live with an impresario of the most beautiful black walnuts in syrup. Oh, it just doesn't get better than that. And I think those additions are what make cooking and eating today so much more than just a back to the farm ethic.
Oh,
It's
I
more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and it's like that fun. I remember when you told me about the Zoom tahina and I tried it and I was like, this is a completely different thing than I've been
Right,
eating. And I
right,
was like mind blown. And the
right,
difference between making your own fresh, that 5-minute hummus
right.
strategy, like that could change somebody's entire like
Exactly,
season
exactly.
of
Right.
cooking. Like, I'm going to try this on this. Now I'm going to try it on that.
Absolutely,
It's going in the salad.
absolutely.
It's going on the,
And a little piece of fish that you broil with it.
oh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And I think that's part of what I felt like on every page of your book is the whispers of, this too can taste better by this means,
Right.
and here's another little thing to tuck away next time you are confronted with this vegetable or piece of something, here's something else you could do. And it isn't, it's funny that you start at the beginning with that hilarious story and also very sort of bittersweet story about your mom's recipe box. You
Yeah,
know, what are those things that contain these recipes may or may not have ever gotten used? They sort of it's sort of like the antithesis of the whispering. It's
right.
like something that's gotten
That's it.
stuffed in a box, never to be seen again.
Mhm. Yep,
And like the duty of having the recipe, but the joy comes from making things with maybe out any recipe at all. Most of the time it seems like the best stuff comes from people more or less knowing what to do with the thing.
that's
And
right.
yeah,
And
and
then those of us who don't instinctively know what to do with the thing can learn from those people. And that's what certainly I write about, and it's certainly what you experience. You have somebody who you live with who knows what to do with those things. And that's what my whispers tell me.
yeah.
Oh, well, try a little bit of this. Or, I talk about making a pepper a pepper sauce with David Tanis. And David lived um, he cooked in Berkeley most of his professional career, but he lived in Santa Fe and had a restaurant in Santa Fe and really got to know chiles. And they just, for me, were mysterious. They weren't a food of my childhood, and they weren't, of course, I enjoyed them, but I had to relearn something or learn them really for the first time. And I think that's an anytime you can change by something you've learned, something you've read. And that's what I mean, basically, that's the source of service journalism,
Yeah.
how you can tell a reader how to do something a little bit better. It's exactly what you do, Pilar.
Well,
People, you try to help people along to find their way through a very confusing morass of information and conflicting ideas. And
mhm.
it's the same thing. We just have a little bit of different subject matters.
Oh, that's so lovely. Well, thank you for that. That's a great honor. But I will also say, that idea of serving the reader, I do think is baked into service journalism, and
Yeah,
yet it's not really, unfortunately, at the core of a lot of what people see and read and hear in media these days, because what's happening is that you get more of what people click on, and the clicking drives more of that, and pretty soon you've got all the stuff that clicks like crazy, but it doesn't really help anybody. And in
No,
fact, all that clicking like mad is making people kind
crazy.
of crazy.
It
Yeah.
absolutely is making people crazy. And I think that voices like yours and perhaps voices like this book is really bringing us back to the heart and the core of
Yes.
what our lives are about and what's meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's right, Dorothy. Well, the idea of being able to pack, literally thousands of years of inherited wisdom passed down through the traditions of all of the respective experts and humans that are in the book, it feels like here's all this stuff that will help. Like, this will actually help how to work with an egg, a leek, a fish, a lemon. Like,
Right.
these are the objects which have carried us through. I got this kind of semi-spotted apple I picked off of my apple tree. And I was like, well, it's almost the season.
Yes,
And, all the things you can do with
right,
apples. Like, wow. Some of which are very simple and some of which are very evolved and
right,
fancy and
right.
amazing. The tarts struck me reading about those. It made me very hungry reading your book. So, a couple questions for you that are just practical ones. If you had to choose a technique for, say, we talked about chard, for example, eggs. I feel like eggs are one of those things where I wish I had more confident whispers in my ear. I can make an egg, but
Yeah.
every time I do, I hear warring voices about the temperature of the pan and the butter and when to turn it or not turn it, and when it releases from the pan or won't. Or what is your egg wisdom,
Well,
received wisdom?
well, I've got two egg stories that I think about right now. One is in the book I say that I wish my daughter would watch the YouTube video of Jacques Pepin making an omelet, because that is one of the classic preparations and it is so simple and he is so accessible and he's so generous. And you know what he uses? A fork, eggs, and a pan.
That's it.
And he just does it. And in a way, if you do nothing but watch that video, and I think it's been watched, millions of times now, the point is that there are no tricks.
Yeah.
It's just doing it and doing it and doing it until it becomes natural. And have I gotten to that point? Not yet. Not yet. And the other thing, I remember when we were doing Saveur, another extraordinary French chef named André Soltner, who had Lutèce, the restaurant Lutèce, and then went on to the French Culinary Institute, where he was an instructor for many, many years. And he came into our kitchen and he showed us how during the war, they would get another egg out of a dozen of eggs by cracking the egg, taking his thumb and running it around the inside so that they would get all the whites out of the egg. And somehow it's the reverence for ingredients. It's not a souffle. It's breaking an egg and it's the whole process.
Yeah.
It's very holistic, if you will. And that's the part of cooking that really entrances me.
Mm. It sounds a lot like a mindfulness practice when you
It is.
describe it that way.
It is, Pilar. I mean, we've talked about and I actually make a little bit of a note in the book about when I wake up in the morning and I think about what's in my refrigerator and what's in my cabinet and what's in my, is there a farmer's market and how am I going to get the food on the table today? I said, it's my mindfulness practice. It's, I've tried the lighting of the candle and the whatever, but my mind goes to the refrigerator. So I think we all have our own way of integrating ourselves into our day. And that's a way, where are my ingredients at? Where are they coming from? And where am I going to go with them?
Yeah. Well, that's the flow, experience basically is when you kind of get to challenge your skill set by doing something that is, inherently satisfying to you and gratifying. And there's always a little bit of a challenge, a little question of how do I overcome this little hurdle? The whisperers, help to solve those riddles for us when we're
Yes,
standing in the kitchen being a little
yes,
unsure. And they also, I think, inspire us to seek a little more deeply within the banks of our own knowledge and wisdom and common sense, and asking ourselves, what am I actually hungry for, whether it's to
yes.
cook or to eat? And
Right.
that return feels important to me in a world where so much is coming at us from the outside. To open ourselves back up to what's already there and to
Exactly.
process that with more reverence and appreciation and curiosity feels like a real win to me.
Well, and
So,
in a way, I think you have to shield yourself, even as you do in another kind of mindfulness practice, which is TikTok and fast
yeah.
moving videos and all of those things. There's so much noise out
Yes.
there, and you have to find your center somehow. Maybe it's in a cabbage.
Yes. And a cabbage. I love that. Oh my goodness. Well, I want to encourage anyone who eats or cooks or wishes that they ate better or wishes that they cooked better to get yourself a copy of Dorothy Kalins' The Kitchen Whisperers, Cooking with Wisdom of Our Friends. I feel really lucky to have you as a friend and a mentor. And, I think that original counsel that you gave me way back at Stanford at the publishing course about, that a good editor serve the reader, serve the reader, serve the reader. You have done that with this book. And I feel like that's maybe what the best whisperers do is figure out how to help us get better at what we want to get better at, eating or cooking or
That's
somewhere in
right. Those are
between.
the ones we hear.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I really appreciate you taking time here with us, and I will make sure that our show notes for this episode include a link to Jacques Pepin making that omelet the simplest possible way, as well as any other links you want to send along. But I'll be sure linking to your book and sending people to find out more about the incredible work you've been doing for decades now. And man, if I can't think of a person who has more good whisperers in their head than you.
Well, I've been lucky. That's for sure. That's for sure.
Wow. I feel lucky to get to spend the time with you. And I look forward to connecting and eating and cooking with you again one of these days when
We'll
we're both
do it.
alone.
We'll do it one of these
Do
days.
it. Love you, Dorothy. Thank you
Okay.
so much. And
Thank you.
congratulations on the new book.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.